I'm, yeah, as Sal said, I'm a Wangaratta boy. I've sort of had, whilst I've sort of been here formally 20 years, I've sort of spent a lot of time in Wangaratta as a kid with my grandparents. I was very close to them, who were true blue Wangaratta people. Um, Tonight we're sort of basically going through the Hodgson's Creek report that was prepared in 2019, and the aim of the presentation is not to run through the report itself, but to give a bit of context around the report, and specifically the two questions that I sort of want to be able to answer for you is, why does the creek behave like it does, and what can we do to manage the creek? And Hodgson's Creek has a very, very interesting history, and it's worthwhile just sort of taking a step back in terms of waterway processes and asking ourselves, what is it that actually influences how a river system behaves and how it forms? And basically, geomorphology in the centre of that particular circle is effectively just the physical form of a landscape, and in our instance, it's the physical form of a creek. And there's all sorts of different elements that contribute to how a river sort of forms and behaves. And there's things like the geology, the sediment, the hydrology, so the amount of water that comes into the system, the hydraulics, so how fast is the flow coming down, how steep is the flow, the size of the channel, and vegetation. And if we think of it in its most simplest forms in terms of how a river works, there we go. Effectively, we're combining the interaction of gravity and water that allows the movement of sediment, which influences the formation of topography. And that leads to erosion and deposition processes, and also sediment transport processes, so sediment moving through a system. And the end result of that is a continuously changing landscape. And our fluvial systems or waterway systems can be subject to changes, whether they be sort of natural or man-made changes. And in result of those changes, the degree of change can be either significant or not significant, depending upon how robust or how resilient is a term that's quite commonly used the system is. And we often use this diagram to sort of represent how complex river systems are. And what I like to talk to people about, and often the question we get posed to when we're standing on a riverbank is, that tree fell in which caused that erosion, or that sediment deposition on one side of the creek is causing erosion on the other side of the creek. And usually there's not a simple cause and effect relationship in river systems. They're far more complex than that. And you don't have to worry about the details in this diagram, but if you take channel depth as an example, and if somehow we end up changing the channel depth due to some particular process, it has the potential to change another 7 or 8 different elements of the waterway system. And that just shows you how it's just not a simple cause and effect relationship most often. And the other thing about river systems is they're sort of trying to reach an equilibrium. And so in a pre-European state, or even in an altered current state, systems are usually trying to achieve or in some sort of balance. And then if there's a significant disturbance in the system, it basically tips the scales, and the river then responds to that particular influence and basically tries to alter it in some way, shape or form. And of course, Hodgson's Creek is one of those systems that have been subject to major change over the history of European settlement. And this is a classic example of something that I really like in river systems, which is combining what we sort of see in the landscape and the evolution of the waterway systems and combining it with history. And of course, the Hodgson's Creek system was, the catchment area up around Beechworth was significantly impacted by mining back in the 1800s. And a lot of that mining occurred through sluicing, which you can sort of see in that top right image there, where they had basically big water hoses that basically just blasted against the bank face and where they extracted the gold from. And gold mining wasn't unique to northeast Victoria, obviously, it was in central Victoria as well, but the impacts of the mining are long lasting, and certainly the results of that mining are pretty visible still today, and they will be very visible moving forward well beyond our lifetimes. And in response to all of this mining upstream, there was basically a large volume of sediment that was moved downstream, and that sediment moved through the Hodgson Creek system and down into the Ovens River system. And there is no doubt that that sediment, the finer components of that sediment, are well and truly sitting on floodplains in the Murray River, far down, probably beyond Victoria, to this day. And we'll sort of talk about some of those processes moving forward. But in response to the liberation of that sediment, it came down in these big slugs across the Hodgson Creek and deposited across the floodplain surface. And one of the issues with this sludge was that it built up and built up and built up, and it meant that the sediment was negatively impacting upon the agricultural land, and it was making it very difficult for the water to pass through the Hodgson Creek and into the Ovens River. And there was basically an initiative that was carried out by there was landholders that initiated the process, but some two councils or shires basically picked it up at the time and decided to channelise Hodgson Creek. And it was a bit of a kerfuffle where I think it was the North Ovens Shire, closer to Wangaratta, and the Beechworth Shire were the two shires responsible for the works, and both of them started channelizing Hodgson Creek from different ends. So the Beechworth Shire started working towards the west down from the hills, and the North Ovens Shire worked from Tarrawingi back upstream. And this happened over a period of years, and the North Ovens Shire were a bit angry that they had to put any money into it at all, and they sort of got to about 700 metres before joining and ran out of money. And so they had to, it took quite a while to even make a continuous channel network through that system. And there's a really good book, if you get an opportunity to, if you're interested in history and if you're interested in mining, and there's some particularly good references around northeast Victoria, including around Tarrawingi and Wangaratta. A book called Sludge that was written by Susan Lawrence and Peter Davies. And it's a story about mining in Victoria and how that sort of influenced the formation of the creeks and towns and the politics. It's very, very interesting. And they provide a bit of a description through witness descriptions of Hodgson Creek prior to mining. And some of the definitions or some of the descriptions that people talk about is a sort of chain of waterholes in summertime, and when the floods came down, it became a river. And large ponds of water, very deep, beautifully clear, and with a good supply of fish. And that's obviously very different to what we see today. And what they're describing there is what we call a chain of pond system. And chain of ponds were basically these series of, if you imagine dams without a dam wall, but inset within the floor of a valley. Now, very, very stable waterway types and quite unique. You don't see chain of ponds more broadly across the world, or even more widely across Australia, but there are a few places where these chain of ponds systems were found, and a lot of them have been destroyed since European settlement. And you might be familiar, there's a town called Chain of Ponds, or a place called Chain of Ponds over in Adelaide and central Victoria. Gianni from Castlemaine out near Avoca, you might be familiar with that area. There's some chain of ponds out near there, and certainly down in West Gippsland there's some, but they're also around northeast Victoria. And Hodgson Creek was an example of where these waterway systems existed prior to European settlement. And then witness descriptions sort of during the mining. just sort of demonstrate the effects of what mining caused. And there's comments such as fences over 1 metre tall are buried in sludge, and one farmer's land was as barren as a sea beach. The bridge across the creek that someone on horseback had once been able to ride beneath is now so silted up that you can hardly crawl through. And grass that struggled to grow on the inundated land is no good, it is sour. The cattle don't seem to care for it. And so this sediment not only impacted the Hodgson's Creek system, but it worked further down into the Ovens River, and there were landholders within Wangaratta and further downstream, past Bonthe-Rambo, for instance, where Reedy Creek sort of comes off the Ovens River. They were complaining about the sludge at the same time, and this led to the formation of a sludge abatement board, and there were some pretty influential people that contributed to the management and action around a sludge, including in northeast Victoria. And one of them was Hopton Nolan, who I think was the first owner of the Plough Inn in Tarrawingi. And this image here is a photo taken of a bank of Hodgson's Creek. And you can sort of see that man there is Ian Rutherford, and he's one of the preeminent sort of geomorphologists in the country. And he's not a tall man, but he's sort of showing there that dark material sort of represents the natural floodplain surface, so the pre-European floodplain surface, and then all that lighter yellow colour material is the material that came down through the mining, and this just came down in big series of slugs or fans that spread across the floodplain surface and spread it right over the valley through there. And you can imagine the devastation that it caused. And I think it was in the 1870s around Tarrawingi that a little boy, I think like a 2 or 3 year old boy, walked out into the sludge and got lost for 2 days. So that's how significant it was. And in response to that channelization and that was created in response to the sludge that was formed, so the channelization was basically done to systematically or efficiently sort of pass the water and the sediment into downstream reaches. That has a lot of impacts upon how the river sort of forms and behaves, which is carried out or carried on until today and moving forward into the future. And one of the features that we see with channelization is a process called bed degradation or bed erosion. And you can see that in this image that it's most clearly represented through like a little earthen waterfall feature. And that's what we call a head cut. And those little earthen waterfall features act like the same way as a normal waterfall feature that we might go and visit in a national park or something, but except being held by bedrock, where those features that are held by bedrock erode back up in an upstream direction, and they might move, 1 kilometre every million years or so. These features, once initiated, might move a couple of metres every year, or in high flow events, they have the ability to retreat, kilometres in one particular flow event. And one of the key sort of results of this particular erosion process is you get, not only does the bed erode, but it results in the banks eroding downstream of where that head cut is retreated into. And in this particular image, we're looking at upstream, and you can see where downstream of the head cut, the channel is much bigger than it is on the upstream side. And so once these features sort of occur and start moving within a system, they basically have the potential to change the physical condition for the river or the creek forever. And not only that, once they become bigger, they end up conveying much more flow within the channel and concentrating the flow within the channel that further exacerbates the erosion within the channel. And that's why you see Hodgson's Creek at the moment is so deep and so wide. And this is another illustration of that process. As the head cut sort of forms in a system, it moves further back upstream, and then that sediment that's generated moves into downstream reaches and deposits further downstream. So in this instance, that deposition would be occurring down within the Murray River, or the Ovens River, sorry, or in the bottom ends of the Hodgson's Creek before it enters the Ovens River. And interestingly, not only do you get that bed deepening process and the widening, but in response to that, the stream basically starts to meander, and it starts to want to become bendy. And that's what you see through here occurring. And I do have, I'll come up more, I've got a couple of videos that'll sort of demonstrate this process a little bit easier as we move forward. So just to go through it again in terms of a cross-sectional view, basically once Hodgson's Creek was sort of channelized, the bed started to deepen. And then in response to that deepening, there was widening of the bank. So effectively you get erosion on both sides of the creek. And this is sort of the process that, or this is where the stage that we're currently at with Hodgson's Creek. It's still in that deepening and widening stage. And if we do nothing about, nothing to manage the creek, over time the creek will start to get much more bendy, windy, and we'll start to see bit more erosion on the banks and getting little depositional features form against the bank profile, and there'll be little floodplains that start to form sort of inset within the big channel that's currently there. And those higher floodplain surfaces in time will become further and further disconnected, so the channel gets bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder for it to break out across the floodplain surface. And that's sort of what you see in this image here. I think this is at the Tarrawingi Eldorado Road, looking downstream at a weir structure. And you can see how that this feature here is acting as a bed control feature. So it's basically trying to manage bed erosion. And you can see that the bed is eroded to that particular point, and both banks are eroding. So we're still in that deepening and widening phase. And then this process, or this image here, shows that if this process is sort of triggered at a particular point, it has the potential to move further up and across the landscape. And so it might be initiated at a single point, but it is a reach-based process that has the potential to influence multiple landholders across the entire catchment. And not only does it stay restricted to the primary stream, like in this case Hodgson's Creek, but you can see in this image here that once it hits these tributary streams, it'll start to propagate, that bed deepening process starts to propagate in those systems as well. And so we'll try and show these videos. We're fingers crossed today, and I think they'll work this time. So can you guys still see that? Is that?
We've got your PowerPoint on the screen.
Okay. All right, bear with me, because I can see it.
Yep,
right.
Got it up there.
Excellent. Okay, so this is a large river system in the USA, and effectively what we're showing is a series of aerial photos captured over a 60-year period. And this system, the current channel course is along here, and it was channelized to more efficiently convey flow through this particular area. And what we'll go through is just a series of photos that show how the channel changes over time. And so you start off in 1939 with a very straight channel in response to that artificial channelization. And then as it sort of moves through the different years, you start to see how the creek, or the river in this instance, becomes more windy or bendy. And that's because waterways don't want to really be straight, and it's trying to reduce its slope, and that's why it's undergoing this bank erosion effectively to reduce the steep slope and to reduce the amount of energy that's passing through the system. And so whilst it's going through that process, it's starting to get those little inset features sort of forming, as we sort of showed earlier. Now I'll go back and I'll show one more file. This one might be a little bit harder to see because it's a bit pixelated, but this is the same process. So there's just water being passed through a sand bed watercourse, and you can see there that once it's been straightened, that the river doesn't want to stay straightened, and hopefully you can see that. But effectively what's happening there is that you're starting to see that bendy channel form in the system, and you're starting to get that deposition and those inset features form through there. And so this is sort of the evolutionary path of a watercourse like Hodgson's Creek in the long term. Do you want me to show them again, Sal? Or are that okay?
I think they're good. Julian, we're going to try and pop them up on our YouTube channel as well so people can have another look.
Yeah.
Another point. But yeah, they were nice and clear.
No trouble. So I'm imagining you can't see my screen again, so I'll go.
I've got PowerPoint up at the moment.
Oh, excellent. All right.
Yep. So you should be able to, yep, continue on. That's
beautiful.
great.
All right. So what we sort of see in a lot of waterway systems in response to some sort of modification is that bed deepening is the cause of erosion in a lot of instances, not always, but in a lot of instances. And then in response to that, you start to see bank erosion. And as we've sort of shown earlier, that one of the ways the bank erosion occurs is becoming more bendy or more sinuous. And that occurs through a process called lateral migration or meander migration. And that involves the erosion of an outside bend and the deposition across an inside bend. And that's quite a natural erosion process that's very, very common. And we see that, most commonly on river systems like the Ovens River or the Murray River, but it's also very relevant to that evolutionary process that we're sort of seeing along Hodgson's Creek, where it's trying to reduce its longitudinal gradient by becoming more windy. And another sort of bank erosion process that's associated with that bed deepening process, as we spoke about, was channel widening. And the difference between that and lateral migration is channel widening occurs on both banks. And that can occur not only in response to bed deepening, but it can also occur immediately or during a really large flow event like we got in just before Christmas in 2018. And one way that occurs is by simply the amount of water that's coming down through the channel, and the channel are trying to adjust to accommodate the volume of water that's passing through the river system. And so we might stop there to see if there's any questions, if that's all right.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent spot to pause for a minute. I haven't received any questions from anyone, but I'm really happy if you have anything you'd like to raise now. So the first part of Julian's presentation is really around the processes that have helped to shape Hodgson's Creek to get it where it is at the moment. And I have to say I loved your historic photos, Julian, because I hadn't seen a lot of those previously. So
yeah,
collection, especially the one with the big, layer of sludge on top of the existing, the older floodplain material. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's present along Hodgson's Creek, but you can also see that on Yakandanda Creek, for instance, and over on the Loddon River. Over near Newstead, it's pretty evident. So, and Bendigo Creek is another good one, where exactly the same situation in Bendigo Creek, where they did a lot of mining upstream and had to effectively channelise the creek to effectively pass through the sediment and the water as efficiently as possible. And again, in those systems, 150 years later, we're still managing the impacts of that disturbance.
So it's really complicated. So the supply of sediment and the changes to the flow regime are both what's governed what's happened to Hodgson Creek. So I've actually got a couple of comments that have come through, which is great. so Ruth's commented that she has land on the Hodgson Creek and Ovens River, and this is explaining a lot of the movement of sand and other matter, and they're very connected, and so I'm glad that this makes sense. And Sue Wilson's just asked that weir in the photo, should it be taken out? And that's a really great question, Julian. The significance of what this weir is doing is it's really important in this system. So I'll hand over to you and you can.
Yeah, thanks, Sal. That's an excellent question that leads us on to the next stage, if that's all right. And yeah. I'll answer that question as we go along. So what can we do? Basically, the main thing about waterway management practices is that we've got to be trying to address the cause of the issue rather than the symptom of the issue as best as we can. And we also need to consider, I suppose, the viability of undertaking works on such a large scale. And it's important in a system like Hodgson's Creek that where the impacts have been widespread, effectively, you know, from Tarra or downstream of Tarrawingi where it meets with the Ovens River, for, you know, right up through nearly almost to Beechworth. And so it really requires a strategic approach that takes into consideration that what's occurring along that whole reach, because in waterway processes, what we see at any one particular site is not necessarily influenced what's occurring at that site. It's usually associated with something that's been initiated or influenced by processes upstream or downstream. And I suppose that was one of the triggers that initiated the report that was done for you guys in 2019. And that report, and we'll sort of talk about each one of these elements moving forward, but the findings of that report basically made reference to the existing grade control structures along the stream and the role that they're currently playing. And those structures are basically controlling the bed grade. And they're quite important in managing that process. So in the absence of those structures being there, the creek will go down that path that we've described previously. So currently it's deepened, it's started to widen, and those rock structures have been put in there to control any further bed deepening. And if they were removed, or if they were to completely fail, in some instances they're in pretty poor condition, basically what we'll see is that evolutionary path that we described before, where the river will continue to drop, it'll widen even further, and then it'll start to develop this sinuous path. And that process is likely to, well, you know, it'd still be probably deepening and widening for the next 20, 30, 40 years before it starts to develop some serious sinuosity. So that process will certainly be occurring well and truly beyond our lifetimes, and it won't reach equilibrium for, again, well and truly beyond our lifetimes, I wouldn't imagine. So they play a very important role. So they're effectively controlling that bed from eroding any further. Vegetation establishment was another recommendation in that report, and Sal quite rightly pointed out the other day that a conclusion from the report was that where the erosion had occurred around structures in 2018, that the structures seemed to perform better where there was vegetation, and certainly vegetation plays a really important role in terms of channel stability. There's also this scattered willows through the system, and willows are a weed of national significance. So there was some recommendations to remove some willows, and there was recommendations also for the relocation of localised in-stream debris blockages and some bank barriering works. And we'll go through most of these in a bit more detail moving forward. Before we do, it's sort of good to just to put into context what we're trying to achieve in waterway health. And often there's this term resilience that's been thrown around, and it's not a word that I'm always comfortable with, and it's sort of been hijacked by politicians of recent times as well, including after or in response to the recent bushfires. But when we talk about resilience within a waterway, we're effectively talking about a healthy stream is a resilient stream. And another way of looking at it often is a messy stream is often a resilient stream and a healthy stream. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about continuous riparian vegetation along a waterway. We're talking about pools and riffles and large wood in the river, and basically that acts to slow the water down and control the rate of sediment moving through the system, and it provides this valuable roughness and protects the waterway from eroding or increased rates of erosion. But it also provides refuge during drought times, and so that variability in bed form, so you get these around large wood, you get pools forming, and vegetation hanging over it is basically provides shade that maintains pools for longer during periods of low flow, etc. And going back to those grade control structures, basically what are they and how do they work? And this is the answer to the question that we were asked earlier. And most often those structures are constructed in the form of what we call a rock chute. And rock chutes are effectively steep armoured sections of rock that are placed in there to either control one of those head cut features that we saw earlier on, or they're in there to reduce the longitudinal slope of a waterway. And basically that's an artificial form of reducing the longitudinal slope that mimics the sinuosity in the form of providing that lower longitudinal gradient. And so they perform two valuable roles in the context in Hodgson's Creek, and that is one, they're preventing further bed deepening, but two, they're also preventing further bank erosion within that system. And so they're quite strategic structures that are important to maintain moving forward. And often they're not constructed in isolation. And so back in the 80s and 90s in particular, there was a systematic sort of strategy that involved constructing a series of rock chutes across several river systems, including Hodgson's Creek, but also along 15 Mile Creek and Burgoigee Creek as examples in northeast Victoria. And the report sort of demonstrates that it provides a bit of a longitudinal slope through the creek there, and demonstrates where these rock chutes are positioned and you know how they're actually controlling the bed gradient. But in a system like Hodgson's Creek, there's multiple of those erosion head cut features throughout the length of the creek, and therefore there's been a series of rock chutes constructed within that system to manage that bed erosion process. There's also, when we talk about erosion, we say that bed deepening is the primary process. Sometimes there's opportunities to do bank armouring works. And basically, in Hodgson's Creek, if we start doing bank armouring works, we're effectively treating the symptom rather than the cause of the problem. But these are a couple of examples of the bank armouring works that have been undertaken in recent times in northeast Victoria. And one of them is rock armouring, which that image in the bottom left is just behind, I keep forgetting, this Super Cheap Auto here in Wangaratta. And that rock armouring job was done to protect the Wangaratta levee that you can sort of see in the background behind the levee there. And a site like this, basically rock armouring is quite an expensive technique, and it doesn't always achieve what you set out to achieve in terms of an objective of river health. And so the widespread application of this technique is generally not recommended, and it's best sort of applied at specific locations where you really need to stop the erosion quite quickly in its tracks, such as if you're protecting a town levee or something like that. And just as an example in terms of the viability of this technique, this rock work would have come from the Glenrowan Quarry. And as a rough rule of thumb, when we cost rock beaching, such as this, we we use as a first pass measure, we use a rough rule of thumb of $100 a cubic metre to supply, deliver and then place. So a job such as this would be tens of thousands of dollars in terms of expense. In the top right here, we're looking at large wood, and that was applied, or a technique that was used up on the Little Snowy Creek up at Estdale. And that's a system there that has got a lot of little pools and riffles and eroded quite significantly after the 2016 floods. And we didn't want to go in there and rock every outside bend. It wouldn't be achieving the type of waterway that we were wanting up in that particular system. And one of the Catchment Authority officers at the time was able to source native hardwood from a native hardwood plantation. So they were able to get access to these particular timbers, and they were used to control the bank erosion in this particular instance. The way it works in both instances is effectively it provides a physical barrier between the active, the moving water and the bank. And so the effectiveness is really dependent upon that good coverage of either rock or timber that provides that physical barrier. In terms of vegetation, vegetation is largely the most successful long-term and effective erosion control measure that we've got available to us. And it works in two ways. Basically, the root systems is one way that it works. So the roots effectively bind the soil together, and those roots don't have to necessarily be provided through large trees. So you often have grasses or sedges that have those really tight root masses, and they can get into those areas lower down in the bank profile that are subject to more frequent flow events. And they're very, very effective at influencing or mitigating against erosion. But it's important to remember that the influence of that vegetation is only, in terms of this particular process, is only effective where that root zone can get to. So if you start vegetation on the top of bank, for instance, you're not going to be able to effectively manage that erosion that's occurring across the toe of a bank. And quite commonly, and a little bit frustratingly, in the past, we've been undertaking revegetation works and starting from the top of bank and moving back. And that's really good in terms of long-term erosion control, but certainly in the short to medium term, it doesn't provide much influence. The second way that vegetation contributes to channel stability is through that roughness element that we talked about before. So basically, when you're on a river or a waterway and you see that white water as it passes through the vegetation or the large wood or the rocks, that's the energy of the water being expended on having to go around those particular obstructions. And in the absence of those features, that energy is still used up, but it's usually used up on contributing to erosion of the bed or the banks. And so a stream that has got that roughness element incorporated into is generally a far more stable system compared to streams that don't have that element in it. And this sort of demonstrates what we were talking about before in terms of where to target vegetation on a stream system. And so it's important that we get that vegetation covered across the lower bank profile where you get the more common flow events and where that erosion is more likely to occur. And so often the erosion is influenced by the active flowing water, or even in some systems that have got a abrasive sort of sediment moving through the system. So you can imagine in river systems with big cobbles or even sandbed streams where once you have a flow event, it lifts up that material and it moves down the system with the water. And those rocks or the sand sort of is also hitting the bed and the banks, and that's what we call abrasion, and that can contribute to erosion as well. And so the physical presence of vegetation in those areas that's more prone to erosion is really, really valuable. And so we try and target vegetation across the entire bank profile if possible. And large wood, we touched upon it before, is a really important element of a healthy, resilient watercourse, and it's very applicable to Hodgson's Creek. And so the way we're describing it before is not only does it provide that roughness element, but it provides a bit of diversity. So you sort of see in the bottom left here where you're getting some of that sand that's moving through this particular system, and it's depositing and causing little scours around some areas there, and it's providing that bit of diversity in the bed for all the little critters and creatures and stuff to hang out. And then just a couple of principles to talk about in terms of land management. We talk about catchment or waterway resilience and the like. It also applies to resilience of a landholder to be able to get back up and running immediately following a large flow event. And hopefully the talk tonight has sort of put some food for thought in terms of where we might be able to predict where erosion is going to occur into the future. And one of those processes we talked about was that outside bend erosion. And quite commonly we put infrastructure quite close to a waterway. And in this instance, you can see there's a pump and a pump shed that's been positioned on an outside bend. And it kind of makes sense because you're sort of looking for a deep hole to be able to extract water from. And in that, the deep holes are often found on outside bends of watercourses. And in this particular instance, you can see where that outside bend erosion occurred after a flood event and the pump shed got washed in. But it's not just limited to private infrastructure. We see this quite commonly as well, and particularly a lesson that was, something that was commonly observed after the 2016 floods across the country, was the placement of electricity poles or telephone poles within close proximity of an outside bend of a river. And the frustrating thing about this, I suppose, was in every instance that sort of comes to mind, that telephone pole had been washed in and partially collapsed, like you can see in that top left-hand photo. And prior to any works being undertaken to stabilise the banks, the utility company had come along and plonked it about 3 or 4 metres from the top of bank on that outside bend again. So effectively that process is just going to repeat itself over time, where it'll consistently be threatened by that erosion of the creek or riverbank. And similarly, in the bottom right image, which is the Gentle Annie Bridge, and that demonstrates that, as we've sort of talked about tonight, when you sort of install a piece of infrastructure like a bridge across a waterway, we commonly make the assumption that that waterway is not going to move for an indefinite period of time, and it's quite common that that's not the case. And in this instance, the outside bend of the King River moved, and it took out the abutment of the Gentle Annie Bridge, and it took many months for that to be operable again. And finally, this is a photo that I like to bring up of a site on an outside bend of a river in a beautiful spot in Tasmania. And this is a person's backyard. And after a flow event again in 2016, there was erosion that occurred of the bank face, and it retreated right back up to that fence line that you can see behind the pirate in the image. And what this sort of shows that it's not just the erosion that occurs that's the immediate risk to your backyard that's the problem, but to be able to then get in and do anything about it can be problematic if there isn't sufficient space to get in there to do it. So for instance, the bank had retreated right up to that fence line, and it made it virtually impossible to be able to get in there and do anything about it. And in the end, at this particular site, to get rock to protect that person's house and their yard, they had to build a big ledge of rock across the base of the river channel, which increased the costs on that job by at least tenfold. It was quite a big job. And then finally, I'd just like to bring up sort of monitoring for you when you're looking at your waterways. And we we often spend a lot of money undertaking works, but the monitoring aspect of it is sort of quite poorly funded and rarely done, and there's several reasons for that. But it's quite important that the monitoring work be undertaken both before and after at particular sites to help inform what's going on within your river reach. And someone like Sally or Craig or I might come out to your property, and it might be the first time that we've actually come to your property, or we see it several times, but under a particular set of circumstances, like in summer under low flow conditions. And we don't get to sort of see it as regularly as you do. And there's a lot of knowledge that comes from landholders along their waterway systems that really is, it can't be overestimated, basically. And so it's a really powerful tool to be able to collect some monitoring information of a particular site over time. And one of the best ways you can do that is by collecting photographs. And this is just a couple of examples of some photographs that have been collected along a river for monitoring purposes. And the one in the bottom left sort of shows a photo from the opposite bank looking across at the river. And unfortunately, this is not a great photo for monitoring purposes because it's sort of taken on an angle that you really can't judge, you know, how much retreat or bank erosion might occur at that particular site. The best way you can do it is using something like capturing it from an angle shown in the right-hand image there, where you can line the photo up against some sort of background feature like a hill or a house, or even better, a fence post or a star picket or something like that. And you can clearly see there that, you know, if that were to retreat over time, you can see, you know, identify the magnitude of how much that's eroded. And it's a really powerful tool for us when we're making a judgment around what we can actually do to manage that bank. Another thing I'd say about that is that, and again, doing several of these presentations, one of my colleagues made a really good observation, is that erosion can occur on an episodic or, like, you know, during flood events, but it can also be gradual. And sometimes you might be looking at this creek, you know, or the bank, you know, once a week, once a month, as you drive past it, or you're walking along it, and you don't notice that change. And we liken it to, you know, watching your own kids grow up, and you watch your kids over 12 months, you see them every day and you really don't notice the change. But your nephews and nieces come over after not seeing them for 12 months and you really notice that change in them. And so photographs are a really valuable tool for monitoring, and we recommend that you do it pretty much annually at the same time of year as possible, or immediately following a high flow event. And that's it.
Thanks, Julian. I think that's excellent discussion of the, you know, sorts of tools that we have to help us look after our waterways. Anyone, we've got quite a small group, so if you'd like to turn your movie cameras on, you're welcome to ask a question personally. While people might be thinking about what to ask, I might kick off with one for you, Julian, just around management. You showed a great slide before of vegetation in the different zones across the waterway. And one of the challenges of planting in the channel section of our waterways, that sometimes we get these really steep sided banks that are near vertical that we're never going to be able to get vegetation established on. And I often get asked, you know, should we batter those banks back so that we can get them to a stable angle so that we can plant on them? And I'm always reluctant to suggest that as a course of action, because I feel that more interference is not necessarily positive. But are there certain soil conditions or instances where you would consider that to be beneficial and worthy of battering that back?
Excellent question, Sal. So basically, I like to think of describing riverbanks as basically depositional features that have occurred for thousands of years. And so a lot of these floodplains have had sediment deposit across them, and over time they get more sediment on top of them, and they consolidate and they consolidate. and as that more weight gets pushed on them, and they become quite cohesive as a general rule. And so a bank that hasn't been disturbed is generally more cohesive than a bank where the material has been battered back or pushed in, where that consolidation is effectively lost. So the contrasting point of view to that is that it's, as you say, it's really, really difficult to get vegetation established on a vertical bank face, and it's much more practical to get it established on a sloping bank face, and even a bank face of 1-to-1, you can get vegetation on that sort of slope. So on a system like Hodgson's Creek, I think battering is quite an applicable technique in the upper bank profile, where the bank is subject to less frequent flow events, if that makes sense. So the toe of the bank and that lower bank profile might be exposed to flow events every year, whereas that upper bank profile might only be exposed to flow events every 10 years, for instance. And so it's a really, I suppose it's a bit like Russian roulette in a way, where you're trying to get vegetation established by battering the bank, and you're hoping that disturbed bank face is not going to be subject to erosion, subject to flow, whilst that vegetation is established, which could be another, half dozen years by the time that vegetation gets to a point of influencing channel stability. So it's a really hard one, and I suppose in most circumstances the other aspect of it is it's quite expensive and impractical to do battering on a scale that's effective at treating erosion on Hodgson's Creek over the long term. But the other really important aspect of that bank battering is that it's still not going to address the bed deepening that might be occurring in that system. And so if the bed's still eroding, and basically the way that channel widening works is you get the bed dropping, and then you get an undercut bank profile across the toe, and then the top of the bank collapses on both sides. Again, you're sort of treating the symptom rather than the cause. And therefore, even if you've battered that bank up, over time, it'll start to steepen up and become vertical again. So as a general rule, I don't think it's that practical.
Yeah, no, thank you. Bruce, did you have a question at all? Anything you'd like to ask?
No, not really. Just thinking about our piece of Hodgson Creek. We've got some steep banks, and just above that we've got quite a wide, really wide area where it just, comes around the bend as it comes down from Beechworth, and just, pours into that bend. And anyway, it's quite wide. I guess that would be an area where we could put some trees on our side. We don't own on the other side. So yeah, I know my mind's just spinning with thoughts. There's also, interestingly, there's some natural head cuts in the rock above us, because it just goes, there's a series of 3 or 4 pools where it just drops down into the next pool and drops down into the next pool, and then into a wider pool, which is a very beautiful natural piece of landscape, really. But I guess that does a good job of slowing down the water in a natural way. Yeah, but it's a good place to take the kids and have a swim.
And natural, really important in these sorts of systems. If Julian, do you want to address that?
Yeah, so that's a really good observation, Ruth, and something that we look at when we're considering what to do with the bed erosion processes. And the bedrock is a really good natural controlling erosion feature. And so like that bedrock within the bed basically represents, like it will control bed deepening if it extends right across the entire channel. So the bed erosion sort of works back, hits the bedrock, and it can't go any further effectively. And it's a natural controlling feature. Yeah, they're quite important features, and they represent the upstream limit of any potential bed erosion process quite commonly.
Does anyone else have any other questions before we hand over to Craig for our next part of the presentation? No? Everyone looks happy. I haven't got anything in the chat room. So thank you, Julian. Really great presentation. We'll be happy to take more questions at the end if something comes to you in the next little session, but I might hand over to Craig now. Craig's going to present to us a little bit about the role of the North East CMA in managing our waterways and just give us a little update on what's happening at the moment with reference to Hodgson and Horseshoe Creeks. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Sally. Sorry, I'm just unmuting myself there a bit slow.
No, all good.
Share my screen. How are we going? Can we all see that?
Nothing shared yet.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, here we go.
Okay. Sorry, excuse me. So look, thanks very much, Julian. That was excellent, really informative. And I'm not sure if you guys, can you still see my face at all while I'm talking?
Yes, we can. Yep.
Excellent, because I just wanted to, re-emphasize that book, Sludge, is bloody great. And I find myself reading, I'm halfway through this at the moment, or maybe 3/4. And I live in Beechworth, so I'll read a little bit about this and I'll go for a bike ride up around 6 Mile Road and around the waterways up there. And yeah, cannot recommend this book more highly. It's a fascinating read, and Julian's really explained some of those concepts perfectly. So I just wanted to, I suppose, emphasize the event that I suppose part of the reason why I'm talking here tonight is to talk about the grade control structures and the, I suppose, the reason that they were built and yeah, behind it. First of all, we had this event in December 2018, and this particular slide here demonstrates just the absolute, scale of the event. It was huge. A 1 in 100 sort of event is demonstrated by the 1% AEP, which basically we're talking about how much flow was going through the waterway in meters per second. And a 1% event, or basically 1 in 100 year event, is demonstrated by a sort of light blue line, and you can see that's around about 200 meters cubic per second, or cubic meters per second. The event that happened on December 2018 was, about 380 cubic meters per second that went down that waterway. So my point is that the event we had, it wouldn't have mattered, no matter what we had in that waterway in Hodgson's Creek, we were going, or Burgoigee and the reaches around that area were going to be significantly flooded, and they were. The actual grade control structures, of which there are 13, I think, from memory, did very, very well to actually mitigate some of the damage that would have occurred without their placement or in stream. But those rock or grade control structures are damaged, and they do need repair or replacement and ongoing maintenance. I'm just going to exit from the slide for the moment and show you another particular thing here. So Julian touched on some of these recommendations before, and I just wanted to re-emphasize some of the findings from the report that was done in 2018 by Julian. And the report was simply commissioned by North East CMA, who I represent, and it was done for the reasoning to apply for funding to federal government, and I'll get to that in a moment. But essentially, what the implications and the recommendations from the report are that, the grade control structures prevented erosion processes significantly, which we touched on just before. However, the lack of the absence and lack of appropriate or suitable native vegetation along our waterway was also a significant impact in terms of the damage to not only the actual creek itself and the adjacent landscape, but the actual grade control structures themselves. If we don't replace or maintain these grade control structures, these rock chutes in the Hodgson's Creek, there is going to be continual damage to not only the rock chutes becoming pretty much, you know, redundant or ineffective, but also the adjacent properties or landscape. The problem we have, which is, this is the clincher, is that the CMA, or who I represent, is not funded anymore and has not been for at least 10 years now for grade control repair. So where we are at the moment is that in March this year, the Northeast CMA has applied to the federal government to put in basically an estimate, or which is, I suppose, part of a claim process for about $1.6 million. That $1.6 million represents a claim for the repair or the replacement, excuse me, of these 13 grade control structures, in addition to the appropriate fencing or grazing management, so basically getting stock out of the water, and woody weed control, which is the willow removal, which Julian touched on, and appropriate revegetation. So looking at those 5 factors for the whole Hodgson's Creek, we're looking at about $1.6 million. And that's the claim that we have submitted now to the federal government. And we've made a very, very strong case to say that if these grade control structures are not maintained, repaired or replaced, then we are going to see another event, maybe not in a similar scale to what we saw in December 2018, but certainly similar style events, which are going to compromise the assets along that waterway. And those assets being, those public assets being the 3 bridges that were lost in December 2018. So was it Golden Ball Bridge, Farmers Road, was it? And Kays Road Bridge, sorry. The problem we have is that the federal government, through their disaster relief funding agency, sorry for the bureaucratic talk here, the acronym is DRFA, and essentially is where state or agencies like the CMA will go cap in hand applying for money for things that we aren't usually funded for. The DRFA, the federal government, do not recognise those grade control structures as being an integral or any way sort of related to the integrity of the public assets, which is those bridges. So we've spent significant time, we put through a claim. I was only out on the Hodgson's Creek about 4 weeks ago, with the assessors for some on-site visits to actually explain and demonstrate to them the relationship between appropriate grade control structures, the system we're dealing with, the history, and the appropriate complementary measures which are integral to a successful grade control structure: vegetation, woody weed removal, and grazing control. And the assessors I was with, I was also with our CEO, Katie Warner. They got it. They were engineers, and even though they're engineers, even though our grade control structures in a waterway are very different to what a standard, typical engineering design is. It all depends on the system we're dealing with. It's all very, some would say, magical in a sense, how you build a rock chute. Even though, which kind of does engineers' heads in, the assessors understood, but they are beholden by the regulations or the policy or the stringent rules behind awarding funding for, for repair of assets after a disaster. So what I'm trying to say is that we are batting hard. We're also, we're not the only CMA across Victoria who is undergoing the same process. There are, most of, or at least half of the CMAs across Victoria are facing similar problems to what the Hodgson Creek community is in terms of trying to get funding for, rock shoots or grade control assets, because we're not funded anymore by the state government for those things. But it's going to be really tough to get this funding. $1.6 million. I think if we get a quarter of that, we'll be lucky. And that's just the bare truth from it. I can explain, why we're not funded, and there may or may not be questions about that. I'm happy to do that, but that's essentially where we are at the moment. So we've got 13 grade control structures. They all need to be replaced or repaired, and therefore maintained. The CMA put through a claim. It's $1.6 million. It's dependent on the approval process by the DRFA, the federal government, and I can't really give you a timeline when that's going to occur. The claim was put in March 2018, but we are pushing hard for it. And before I finish, I also just wanted to show you, just to touch on or strengthen some of the really important discussion points that Julian was talking about, so we're talking about battering banks before, and et cetera, et cetera. This is a grade control structure, or a rock chute, that was built in 1990. So most of those rock chutes along the Hodgson Creek were built circa that age. This is looking upstream towards Rusholme Road. I'm just going to go full screen, sorry. So this is, obviously we've seen there has been a battering. There's been some, you can see a grade control structure that's been built through the system. This is what it looks like about 13 years later. So this is a really healthy, repaired grade control structure. Rock is not the only answer. The report makes very, very clear, as Julian did earlier, that for a healthy system that's been impacted anthropologically in the past, you need rock, you need proper grazing control, and you need revegetation and woody weed removal. And this kind of demonstrates, what Julian's talking about in your system, Hodgson Creek. This is, sorry, if I just go, this is that same sort of the same area. This is looking downstream from Rusholme Road, from the bridge there. And you can see, again, a really healthy system. You can't see the rock, but it's just down there through that Phragmites, which is that common reed that you're looking at down there in stream. Again, healthy system. We've got native vegetation. There's a little bit of willow in there, a little bit of blackberry, but we've got some nice, native wood there that's acting as a natural grade control structure. A really healthy system, even though it's got a very limited setback there of about probably no more than 10 metres. I mean, average about 5. This is the same spot. The photo was taken, but it's looking directly upstream from the bridge, okay, on Rusholme Road. This indicates a system that is not being maintained. So there's a rock chute further upstream that is in disrepair, but you can see that we've got open stock access, limited native vegetation. There's no woody weed really in presence, so no willow or blackberry, but trampwood banks, really nothing there at all to stabilise those banks or slow down the water in any sort of capacity. These photos are all back to front, sorry. This is a bit further upstream from where that photo was just taken, and you can see just after the flood in 2018, how active that event was. You can see those banks there have been recently eroded, furthering widening. You can't see the deepening, but there's definitely been a widening there, it's obvious. And if we go to, this is again the same spot we took the photo of before, on the bridge looking downstream, and you can see directly after that event, we've got that healthy system. You can see that woody debris or the trees being moved to the left bank there, brushed against the side as well as on the right hand side. But the frag, it may look pretty pretty ugly, but it's actually done an excellent job. So it can sometimes be hard to convince people of that, but that Phragmites is now standing directly upstream, directly, just standing upright, I should say. It's really, that common reeds really help to slow that water down, prevent, deepening and widening. Sure, there's been some damage. Absolutely. We're talking about a 1 in 2,000 year event. Doesn't matter what was there, you're going to see damage, but it's really prevented, what could have been a hell of a lot worse. And that's, I think I showed you post-flood as well. That's the same spot taken on the bridge there at Rusholme Road, looking directly upstream. Again, just, complete carnage. I think that's it from me. There may be questions about, the CMA's role further, but I'm happy to take that.
Thanks, Craig. Oh, great photos, by the way. I don't think, it's really important not to underestimate even what the cover of grass on banks will do in a flood, just in terms of direct protection of the soil surface for erosion. And that's why maintaining cover on your banks is so important. And I think that Craig's really touched on the bit where Landcare can step in here. So, we may rely on the CMA for some advice and funding and help with the maintenance of these grade control structures. But in terms of actually managing that vegetation along the waterway, working hand in hand with farmers to look at, how do we fence these waterways cleverly and smartly? What sort of offsets do we need? What sort of vegetation? How can we plant them? That's sort of where our project comes in. And we've got funding to allow us to have those one-on-one discussions with landholders on the creek at the moment to actually sit down and work out some of those details for the properties. We may not be able to fund all of the fencing and re-veg under our current Landcare program that we have, but I'd like to see us get in a position where we have some of those plans in place so that if and when we can attract that funding, we actually are ready. We're shovel ready. We know what we need to do. And look, we've got the people to help sit down and talk with you about the best sort of species and how we can plant them and what zones we want to target. And I think we need to be proactive moving forward in really looking at how we're going to establish veg on these creeks for the long term. And I think that, I think Landcare is a really great vehicle and it's placed really well to be able to offer that assistance to landholders. So we better open this up for questions because I'm conscious of the time. So if everyone was happy to turn videos on if you like, and you're welcome to ask anything directly from our speakers, either Craig or Julian. Julian is still here as well. Does anyone have any questions? Or comments even, if it's not a question, if you want to comment on something that you've picked up tonight that you didn't know, that would be useful for us as well.
It was a very informative presentation, and it's really good to get a good idea on what's happening around, especially now that I'm the coordinator for the rural city of Wangaratta for the NRM and sustainability unit, but I'm not familiar with a lot of areas, so this has been really interesting tonight.
No, thanks for attending, Tina. It's great to have you here. I don't think we have any other questions then. I think I've asked what I needed to ask of everyone as well. So if we don't have any further questions, we'll close off tonight. I'm very happy. Everyone has my email contact details. If you have something that you'd like to ask of our speakers in a one-on-one setting, I'm happy to provide some contact details if you'd like to get in touch with them after the session. We will make the recordings of our Monday night session and tonight available on the web as well. Ruth, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say, is the book freely available?
Good question.
Or you have to order it?
Craig, where did you get your copy? Beechworth Books or?
Sorry, can you hear me? I'm not on mute? Yeah. Yeah, sorry, Ruth, this is mine. But you can get it.
No, I know that.
Beechworth Books. Just go to Booktopia or, any one of those. Just Google it. Sludge, it'll come up and you'll be able to get it within a week. Yeah, I think it's about $15. Yeah, and the library has it for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
I'll just add to that, Sal, if that's all right. There's a group of academics that have done, including Susan Lawrence, who's one of the authors, who's they've got a project that they call Rivers of Gold. And if you just Google Rivers of Gold, there's some other information there that will sort of give you some good reading and good resources on the topic, yeah.
So I've just got one other question. The title of the report, the Hodgson Creek Report 2019, is that just the title, or what is that report actually called?
I can send you a copy, Ruth. A copy?
That would be marvellous.
Yeah, anyway, if anyone would like a copy, it is quite a detailed technical report of around 40 pages, but I've read it, and certainly it's very well laid out. You can look all the way from the Ovens River, you know, back up and have a look at all the structures, and there's photos during the floods. There's also lots of stability analysis in there, but even just reading the conclusions at the end are really valuable. So I've got it as a PDF, and I think that's okay if we forward that to communities, Craig, if people would like to read it. Yep. So I'm happy to, I'll send that to you after the session tonight. Yep.
Okay,
no
great.
trouble.
Thank you, Sally.
Very good. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for giving up your Thursday evening. I hope we've added to your understanding of waterway management and waterway processes. And thank you very much to Julian and Craig for coming along tonight. And yes, please keep an eye out for further information about our program that we're offering at the moment. And if anyone else would like to put in an expression of interest for fencing and re-veg, please give me a call and I'll help you to work through that. It's really just a pretty simple form of what you'd like to do and where on your property, and then we can come out and start working with you to develop a bit of a site plan. So I think that's all good. All right, everybody. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Sally.
Thank
Thanks
you,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.